Hi, everyone. Welcome to Restitch America. My name is Alma, Ohene-Opare, and I'm very excited to be here with you today. This is episode number 24, and I can't believe we've come this far, 24 episodes in, and I'm very excited to be here today with my producer, Jenny Johnson, who has been instrumental in getting us to where we are today. So thank you, Jenny, for all the good work. And today's episode, as promised last week, is going to be very different, but also very interesting. And the reason is because the topics we're going to discuss today have to do with a very sensitive issue. And it's not just an issue that is historical and needs to be known about, but I believe an issue that speaks to what we do today and every day going forward. We're going to be showing you some footage that some of you may find gut-wrenching. We'll be sharing stories that you may find hard to hear or hard to bear. But I think it's important that we not shy away from the truths of the past, even though some of those truths may be provoking to us in a certain way. I think it's important that we remember the things that have happened in the past, including the injustices of the past, and turn those experiences into positive action today and in the future. And so that's a goal for this episode, and I hope you enjoy it. This is, I would say, one of the most important episodes we've done in 25 episodes. So I hope you enjoy it. But the most important thing here is it is not good enough to just hear these things and keep it to yourself and ponder it in your heart. It is important to share things like this. And so I'm going to make a plea, a special plea to you, if you've never shared any of our content, to take the opportunity to share this one, because this is a message and a history that people need to hear. Now, before I begin, I'm sure some of you will be wondering, what is he wearing? And why this colorful, medley in front of you? And so I want to take just a minute to share a little bit of my kind of cultural background with you. So as you know, I'm originally from Ghana. And so if you ever see a pattern that looks like this, you should be rest assured to know that this is from Ghana. So this is I'll call it a ceremonial pattern of material that you have in Ghana, and it's called the kente in Ghana. And it belongs to the Ashanti tribe. However, it's been adopted by other tribes in the country. And people usually wear the kente for special occasions. And we use it in other pieces of attire and so on. And so when you see this, this represents the vibrance and the beauty and the cultural heritage of Ghanaians. And so we love this, and we wear it, in at different occasions. You will see this, people wearing things with kente during their weddings or special occasions and so on. So now that you know, I'm sure you'll be seeing a lot of these patterns out in the world. Now you know it comes from Ghana, and it's called the kente cloth. All right, so now that we have that out of the way, let's introduce kind of how our episode is going to go. So I'm going to turn the time over to Jenny and have her explain what is going to happen over the next few minutes.
So we're going to change things up a little bit. So I am actually going to be interviewing Alma because he had the opportunity to go to Ghana this past month and spend 2 weeks there. And while he was there, he decided to visit 2 slave castles that were present in Ghana. So the 2 castles he visited are known as Cape Coast Castle and Elmina Castle. And so what I wanted to do to start off is get his thoughts leading into it. So Alma, could you tell us a bit more about the areas surrounding the castles and tell us your thoughts as you approach them?
All right, so Cape Coast is actually was originally the capital of Ghana before it was shifted to Accra. And so Cape Coast is a very, I would say, it's not as modern as Accra, but it's pretty modern looking region of Ghana. And I actually went to school in Cape Coast. I went to boarding school for 3 years in Cape Coast at a college called the DeSaddle College. And so I'm very familiar with the Cape Coast area. But funny thing, I was in college for, not college, I mean high school. I went to high school in Cape Coast. And in the 3 years that I was in boarding school in high school, I never visited the Cape Coast Castle. And so it was later on after high school that I actually had the opportunity to go and visit the Cape Coast Castle. And so this particular trip was the third time that I was visiting that castle. And when I did, actually, I think it's the fourth time. When I did, every time you go, the experience is a little different. And the experience is different because you're going to have a different guide who brings a different perspective to the historical happenings in that area. But the area is surrounded by water, it's by the shore, and it's surrounded by small villages and fishermen. And when you get into the castle, you see kind of the monument of the castle, and it stands out as you see it. And then as you go into that monumental building and you begin to hear the stories of the things that occurred there, my first thought was, is this what we built a monument to? Is this where we put our energies as people? And to come to find out that most of that building was built by the slaves that it housed, that even makes it even more surreal.
So while you were there, you were able to get permission to film there and also receive footage from the staff there, which was tremendous for us because we're able to show all this amazing footage because of the staff there at these castles. So to give people some knowledge about what went on there, from the documentaries and footage we were given, it talked about how most of these places started off as trading sites first. So, and the Portuguese were the first people that started to, and then later the Dutch took them over, and then the English put a kibosh on it, and that was pretty short-lived, but they even had occupation there for a little bit. And I didn't know this, but like the name Elmina comes from Portuguese, so like the mine or Elmina. So the whole purpose of why they stayed at first was for trade. But then around the 1500s, it started to shift from goods to human trade, which was a huge transition. And I know that at least in the footage given, they were a lot of the questions that were asked were, well, why did it shift so drastically? But I wanted to know what your thoughts were when you realized like the castles like Elmina and Cape Coast, they first started off, especially with churches inside. So one of them I remember you talking about in particular had a church at the center of the castle. And then so I think some question in my mind at least is, how do you think like people were able to shift from just kind of a religious mindset of the whole purpose of them being there for trade and then also to house missionaries, and then all of a sudden shift from trade, and this was of course over the course of about like 100 years or so, but they shifted from a trade mindset to going into human trade? And what were your thoughts on that as you were learning about it?
So that was something that I had never been to the Elmina Castle.
Mm-hmm.
So, as a Ghanaian for 19 years living in Ghana, I never went to the Elmina Castle. So this was my very first time there. And I thought it was a little surprising to me when I heard that, I think a lot of times we think, okay, people came in because they wanted to enslave people, and that was their primary goal. But I learned actually that that was not the case. And as you said, they came because of the rich resources of the country. And so Ghana was formerly known as the Gold Coast. And the reason is because of the abundance of gold, to the point that they could exchange gold for basic things like mirrors and smoking pipes and alcohol and things like that. So that was the initial intent, was to come in and to trade with the people. Now, you may today, in today's terms, consider that trade, gold for alcohol, as not a very fair trade. But because Ghana was the Gold Coast, gold, even though it was valued, there was such an abundance of it that, it didn't matter that they were actually giving away some gold in order to get things that they would otherwise never have. And so they thought it was a fair trade. And when the foreigners came in, one of the things they realized is that the people had a very kind of strict system of government. So they had their chiefs and they had their government set up such that they felt that it would be disruptive to them if they upended that entire system. So rather than fighting against the chiefs and kind of taking over, they thought we can work with these people. And when we work with them, we will achieve better outcomes for everybody. So the intent initially was to trade, and maybe they thought they were getting gold for alcohol, and maybe that was, could be looked at as unfair, but it was voluntary. So in Elmina, when the Portuguese arrived, were not even allowed on shore. Their boat or their ship was out in the sea, and they were not given a place on shore for 11 years. And so it was later, after the 11 years of constantly pleading, that the land that the castle was built on was finally given to them by the chief of the area. And so once they came in, like you said, it was for trading purposes until the slave trade kind of took over eventually. All right, so now let me jump into kind of my feelings when I learned that they came for trade and then turned into human trade. My feelings initially, as I thought about that, was how people can be susceptible to a transformation that is detrimental to themselves and to others if they are motivated by greed, right? And so initially, these people needed workers to staff their plantations in the West. And they found that the Africans were very strong and less susceptible to disease. And once they found that information, I'm sure someone woke up one morning and thought, what if we could transport the Africans from their continent over to the West? And how are we going to do that? And this is the beginning of that process. And one of the things I learned that came to me like a ton of bricks was the fact that one of the ways they justified what they did was that they concocted the idea that the Africans have no souls. And so if you don't have any soul, then you are basically like the animals. And if you are like the animals, then we are blameless before God because we can, move animals and we can do certain things to animals that are not considered sin, right? And so that's how they justified some of their actions, by coming up with these justifications that Africans had no soul. So that was also very interesting. That was something I hadn't heard before. And eventually, once this practice began to expand across the world, then they needed more and more of these slaves. The demand for slaves became higher and higher, and they had to meet the supply. And that is when they began to create schemes to get more slaves from the interior of West Africa, not just the coasts.
I think that's interesting too, because just like mentioned before, we were talking about how the whole purpose of why they were there was not only for trade, but it was for missionary work. So to shift your mind from like teaching about Christianity, because the main religion for the Portuguese at the time was Catholicism. So they were teaching these people who they believed had a soul. So it was interesting that their mind shifted over like almost a century or so of, well, I guess they don't have a soul, which is why this is okay. So it just kind of reminds me of how, like you said, how easy it is for people, if they're motivated by the wrong means, to make justifications for things that they originally did not believe and was their not original purpose of why they were there. And so
And
that was something that was also very interesting to me.
one thing that I also learned is I think sometimes we may conflate the quest to spread Christianity with
Mm-hmm.
the slave trade, and they're not always they don't go hand in hand a lot of times. So many of the missionaries that came to Africa did not return, and the reason was because they came in and most of them died from malaria and other local diseases. And so many of them were very selfless people who believed that it was their duty to share the gospel as Jesus had commanded. And so that was not necessarily in parallel with the slaves or the slave masters. The slave masters may have been Catholic, but not necessarily the same people as the missionaries, right? And so they came, they did establish their churches and so on, but they were not necessarily the same group of people. And so sometimes people talk about, oh, the only reason why Africa is Christian for the most part is because of slavery, and that is actually could not be further from the truth. Africa has always had Christianity, and so it was not necessarily, if you look at African culture and you look at African history, you will find that a lot of our cultural and traditions and everything stems from things that you find in the Bible. And so this was way before anybody, came onto our land. And so the two things are not all, sometimes they're conflated together, but they're not always that way. Yes, we had Christians who came and perpetrated the slave trade, but they were not necessarily the same people as those who came to share the gospel.
And what you mentioned about some of the missionaries originally dying off, that was why they stuck to the coast. A lot of the foreigners that came to Africa, especially Ghana, they stuck pretty close to the coast because it was common for people, especially when they arrived there, to become ill with malaria, which is again why you said they chose African slaves in particular, is because they had almost a strong resistance to other diseases because they already had many diseases present in Africa that were much worse than some of the ones in Europe or even the Americas. And so when you mentioned that, it kind of reminded me of that. Is a lot of foreigners, a lot of castles, or at least close to it, stayed pretty close to the coast, and especially in other locations of Africa. And so that's also a very interesting note. So they didn't do things alone, and that was something that was also very interesting to hear from the footage and from the guides in particular, was how they were able to gain relationships. And it almost reminded me similar of how the Native American relationships were with in the colonies in the Americas, was they gained relationships with different tribes. And that's kind of how they were set out and able to find slaves, or find what they called prisoners of war. Another thing that was very interesting was they talked about how there was already almost like a servant system in place in Ghana, even before the slave trade even started, which almost reminded me a little bit of Europe with indentured servitude. But they also said it wasn't really indentured servitude, it was more on the lines of servants that when they fulfilled their work, and I think it was POWs were often in these cases, they were often prisoners of war that were in the system of servitude. And there were also people who had committed crimes or who owed a debt. And so once they fulfilled their time or served their debt, basically they were free men. So they were no longer enslaved. So there was already sort of a system in place that was similar to Europe, and it was sophisticated, which a lot of people don't think about when they first start learning about this. And then it kind of spiraled into servitude in a slave sense, because the tribes were all of a sudden receiving things that they hadn't received before. And I remember you talking about this at one point, was they were receiving weapons. Could you tell the audience a little bit more about that?
So just to back up a little bit, yes, there was a very robust, you would say, system of servitude in Africa prior to the coming of the Europeans. And so, just as you said, that system did not condemn a human to a state of permanent servitude, right? There was this idea that they had a debt or they had something they owed that they had to pay for. And once that payment was done, they reverted back to their natural state, which was as free people, right? So the idea that a person was born a slave and by virtue of their, by dint of the color of their skin or by dint of, the geographic location that they were born into, they were inherently, inferior and had to be subjugated and seen as inferior. That was not something that existed in Africa. That was something that was brought over and exacerbated by the slave trade. Because of the need for these slaves, right? If you treated them as employees, right, you incurred a lot of costs, right? And so they had to come up with this system of subjugation so that they could justify not having to pay these people and to use their labor to do the things that they needed to do. So what they did for the most part was these European empires were rivals to each other. They were trade rivals to each other. And so when they arrived on the coasts, one person would arrive in Cape Coast, another group arrives in Elmina. So the Dutch ended up taking over the Elmina castle. The British ended up taking over the Cape Coast castle. So there's a rivalry there. And so what they would do is arm different tribes. So they made alliances with different tribes. And so once they armed the tribes, then the incentive for these tribes was to go and fight each other. And the reason for that is once you were armed, now you could go and take from your neighbor. And so if you didn't fight, you were conquered and taken as slaves. And so there was an incentive on both sides for these tribes to fight each other. And so they created a pipeline for the capture of people to be brought to the castles and transported over to the West. And so that's how it started. People started fighting each other. And then once they had the weapons, they fought each other, and then they captured slaves and then brought them across into the various castles. And so between the Elmina and the Cape Coast castle, I believe the estimate is about 3 million or so slaves were taken through those castles. And many of them were captured on the battlefield. These were people who were prime fighting age. And then also they had women slaves. And we asked, why did they need women? And they said, well, one of the reasons why they had women slaves was because they wanted to create more slaves, right? And when you think about that, that is quite bizarre to think about it, right? To say, I want to add women to this experience because I want the ability to infinitely create more slaves. And that is just, when I think about it, it's a little surreal when you think about it. And walking through those castle walls and going into the dungeons, it's an experience that I can't explain. And I'm hoping maybe one day I start a tour company and take people over there to go and see it and experience it themselves, right? When you walk into the walls and your feet are touching the ground, right? And you hear the guide telling you that what you are standing on is the calcified remains of human excrement and blood and vomit and food particles and urine and everything calcified into the ground. They actually had the opportunity a few years ago to prove that by excavating one of the floors in one of the dungeons. And they went probably a few inches before they saw the brick, the original brick that was there. And they actually did some testing on the material that they pulled up and confirmed that it included human tissue, human remains, human excrement. One of the things I learned also that was very difficult to hear was that when someone would die in one of these cells, one of these dungeons, the guards dared not come in and get them, because if they went deep enough into the dungeon, they themselves would not come out alive. And so if someone died, they left them there until the next shipment of slaves, so that then when they would move people, they could then get the dead out. And so if you were there and your brother or your sister or somebody died, you were lying next to the remains of that person for weeks before they were taken away. You can imagine just the smell of the mixture of everything in there. And when we got in there, you get in there, you're sweating profusely. You're sweating profusely. You can't stop the sweat. And you look up and there are 3 holes. And these holes are the entire ventilation that you have in there. So you feel already kind of weak because you don't have enough oxygen, and it's completely dark. And so when you get there, one of the things they do is they turn off the lights, and you realize just how dark it was in there. And you begin to just get a little bit of a glimpse into being in that room potentially with 600 other people who had been captured. And because they were captured from different areas of Africa and brought over, because of that, they did not speak the same languages. And that made it very difficult for them to communicate with each other to mount any kind of resistance. Okay, so the conditions were extremely horrible. And if you were one of those slaves who had in their mind the desire to fight back, they immediately squelched that desire by eliminating you from the group. And there was one cell, a condemnation cell, where you were taken, put in there, and nobody that ever entered that cell came out alive. That cell had 3 doors that you had to go through in order to get into the inner of the cell. And you had to kind of bend down as you go in. And then once you were in, that was the end for you. You didn't come out alive. And both castles had a condemnation cell that people were put in.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that one. That one is one that I wanted to talk about in more depth towards the end, and then also talk about some other things that came up with the staff, because there were a couple things that really stuck out to me, and the condemned cell was one of them because of how dark it was. But I want to kind of go into the dungeons a little bit more. There was some footage that you shared on social media regarding the female dungeon and then also the male dungeons, and you had an opportunity, like you said, to walk through those dungeons. And something that struck me, and it's always hard hearing it, the purpose of why they had female slaves there. And I think for some viewers who are women, we could kind of understand what some of those reasons might be. And it's something that we can't necessarily say openly on our video footage, but I think the connection is there. And so, and you shared that a bit on Instagram of the purpose of why these women, some of the women were there. And there was a staircase in particular, but there was footage taken where it showed the center kind of courtyard area of the castle. And you mentioned this in your footage, where they would have the female slaves come out, and the governor there at the time, or even some officials that were there for trade, could look on the women and decide, which one was valuable in their eyes, and then select her. And because she hadn't been clean for weeks, and she had, like you said, in the dungeons there were remains and excrement and other things there. Imagine what it was like in the dungeons at that time. So these women were unclean and out in fresh air and had the opportunity to bathe, and they were quite vulnerable. And there was a specific moment where if a woman was selected, she'd be have to bathe in public among her peers, and then she would be taken up a staircase that was leading to the governor's chambers. And so when you heard this particular thing, and this came up quite a bit in the footage we were given, and then also throughout the time that the guides went about the tour, is the treatment of women. And I feel like it was very simple when they talked about the men, because the men were there for a specific purpose, because they were the strong men that were the labor. But the purpose of having female slaves wasn't just for procreation, but it was also for those less than savory
Exactly.
activities. So what were your thoughts when you first heard about this and then saw the staircase leading up to those chambers?
Wow. Once again, this was my first time in Elmina, so this is the first time I had seen this complex.
Mm-hmm.
And we went through a tunnel as we got into this complex, and you get there and you see it's almost like you have all the slave quarters all facing in towards the courtyard. And in the middle of the courtyard, they had a well, basically, that had, I think they said, about 14,000 gallons of water in it. And so the women who were there, usually before the slaves were brought into the castle, they had their last bath about, I believe, some many miles before they got to the castle. And while they were in the castle, they never got any baths. They were not allowed to shower. And so you can imagine women who had been brought, who had been left in their conditions, and understanding that you're still not only dealing with blood and feces and sweats and vomit and everything, but you have to sleep in that every single day with no opportunity to change your clothing. And so this is possibly the worst possible thing a person could endure. It was definitely cruel, inhumane. And then to add to all of that, those same people perpetrating this evil would also then take advantage of these women in their vulnerable states. And the only time a woman would receive a bath was if she was chosen to be assaulted by the governor or any of his compadres, I would say. And as I saw, I pictured in my mind's eye, a woman being called out in the middle, and I thought in her mind, is she thinking, is this good? Is this bad? At least I get a bath. And to make that choice that in order to get a bath, I have to subject myself to this. And then after she's showered in front of everybody and cleaned up, then she's led to the staircase, but it's like 3 stories high. And so she's going to climb up this staircase knowing exactly what is going to happen to her. And she has no say. And she's led up staircase, stair by stair, and the floor on the 3rd level opens up to allow her to enter into the governor's quarters. And then she would be assaulted. And in some cases, these women got pregnant. And when they did, then they built what they call stone houses on the outskirts of the castles, and they housed these women who had gotten pregnant and raised their children. And one of the biggest tragedies of all this was the fact that many of those children were educated and brought up to see their mothers and their uncles, to see them as inferior to them. And many of them were trained, and in some cases became worse slave masters and more terrible to the slaves than their fathers had been. And this is where I think about, how does this parallel kind of our world today, when the people who are potentially descendants of things that are terrible end up doing the same things. You see that a lot when abusers or people who have been abused end up becoming abusers themselves. And it's just a terrible thing to go through. And just imagine, I'm married, I have 2 daughters, and to think that they would take these women and put them through that kind of experience is mind-boggling. And then to think that in many cases, the female slave dungeon was built right under the churches. So the church is above, and people walk through as they go into church, and the dungeon is right below. And you can imagine that they would hear the cries, the suffering, while they worshiped their God above, right? And the cognitive dissonance that it takes to be able to walk through, to go to church, to talk about loving your neighbor as yourself, to talk about turning the other cheek, to talk about, all those things, and then walking past the slaves that you were abusing, and not having something prick your heart, right? In the Cape Coast Castle, as you walk into their church, like there was literally a hole, a breathing hole, that you could see the slaves down there. You could not avoid them. You could not avoid them as you walk past to get into the church. You could not avoid them. And what this tells me is the complete degeneracy of the soul, and the fact that we as human beings have a potential to get to that point where we can be completely degenerate and be unfeeling, and to inflict such suffering on others for the purpose of profiteering from their labor. It's, as I said, the more you think about it, the more kind of solemn the experience seems.
Mm-hmm.
And the question I keep asking myself is, what is the purpose of learning all these things?
Mm-hmm.
What is the purpose? Why is it important for us to recount these experiences? Why are we sharing this today? And I think there are 2 things that a person can do with this information. One, you can use it as a way to recriminate and use it to point fingers at other people and say, this person was responsible for that, or that person was responsible for that. And my anger is justified because someone did something to my ancestors. That's one way you could go. But one thing that the guides made us remember was that they said no one was exempt from this. No group of people was exempt from this. And what they meant by that is there were empires or countries that did not come to the shores of West Africa, but they also bought slaves on the open market. Okay. And for those who think, oh, this was just a white man's problem, this practice was spread out throughout the world. So Arabs came to Africa and got slaves. This was happening even before the white man came. And once again, Africans captured their brothers and sisters of other tribes and sold them into slavery. And so nobody has clean hands here. This is a blight on the world, not on any particular race, not on any particular group of people. It is a blight on the world. And because of that, we have to look at this experience as something that impacted every facet of our existence as human beings. And therefore, if we somehow take this and say, well, this is a white man's problem and the white people need to fix this or that, we are ignoring a lot of the sentiments and a lot of the flawed thinking that got us into that situation in the first place. Mm-hmm. This idea that a group of people have a different burden in the world than others. Right? This is something that we have to look at as something we all need to atone for. Right? And the way we do so is to acknowledge that it happened, open our eyes and see those atrocities, and understand the pain that people went through because they were subjugated to this treatment. Understand the struggle for freedom and the restoration of that freedom. Mm-hmm. And recognize that the only way we move forward in the process of acknowledgement, it is important that we do not shackle ourselves back into the chains that we have broken away from physically. Mm-hmm. And that's the other part of the lesson as to why we need to learn this. It is such that we can see how far we have come from that point to our current state. And that if we keep our minds shackled to that past, that we rob ourselves the opportunity to make something of our heritage and our legacy. If we keep looking back, right? If we keep looking back and holding on to that hurt, then we rob ourselves the opportunity to create a better world for the generations that come after us. Mm-hmm. And so it's important to learn the history, but it is also important to learn that we can let go of that history. Mm-hmm. And embrace a true understanding of our value today. And then to take that value and change the world and change our circumstances. That is what we need to do with this information. Mm-hmm. And I hope that, I am a small voice in a giant world. I don't know what kind of impact I can have on this. Mm-hmm. But in the little, sphere of influence that I have, I want people to look on this information and not only mourn, which I think is very necessary, but then to also recognize how far we've come.
Yeah. And it reminds me of something that I remember a while back, of how oftentimes I hear people say that they can't imagine what it was like. And my first thought is, I bet you're a mom that listens to a murder podcast, so I think you have some imagination. But oftentimes I think that we have this knowledge, or it's important for us to learn about this or have it in place in order to remember the things that have happened and have that knowledge so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. And so we don't fall into that vicious cycle, because I think sometimes we think we're a little exempt from that because we're so progressive, right? Or we're so modern. We're in 2023, guys. Like, we know what we're doing. But then this is human nature, right? It's very easy in a time of prosperity to start to turn down a road that's not necessarily the best, all because we're in that prosperity. And so these are important lessons for us to learn. And before we close, there were two specific points that I wanted to touch on really quick. One of them was the condemned cells. And then the second one was touching on what you've kind of subtly hinted at, was mental slavery. And so, but first I want to talk about condemned cells. I kind of referenced it a little bit, talking about how it was this room where it was completely closed off from light. They found the one room that had nothing in it, had completely limited light, and there was nothing for them to feel. And oftentimes the people that were taken into this room were the ones that resisted the most. So these were the people who were the freedom fighters, the men or women who were wanting to fight back for their freedom. And they were taken into this room and they were left there to die. And then once they were dead, they were tossed out to sea. And then if anybody else came, like that room was an incentive almost that placed on these people that you have no ability to resist, because if you resist, you will perish. And so what was your thought when you saw this room, and were you able to step into it?
I did in both castles have the opportunity to go into the condemned cells. And in Elmina, it was a little more gut-wrenching because we actually saw the fingernails of people who had scratched the granite walls. Think about granite and how hard it is. And to think that you could see the fingernails of people who had struggled for their last breath in that room. It is, when you think about it, quite horrific. But this is psychology. And the psychology of conquering any people is to take the strong, the fighters, the opposing voices, and to eliminate them. Right. So as I was thinking about that, I said, yes, I know today there are a lot of things going on in the world, but what are some of the parallels that I can draw here? And it is this idea that in order to stop any kind of revolutionary movement, the way you do that is to identify the people who are the truth tellers, the people who are going to change things, the people who can inspire other people to stand up. Identify those people and eliminate them. And the way they would do that is once they were taken, they were, of course, scourged, beaten in some cases, and then they were dumped in there. And when they were in there, they were condemned to die. But one of the things I learned as well was that if multiple people went in there together, they all had to die before they came back to open the doors. So if you were there and you were there with two other people, you had to watch them die. And then you yourself die. And as I was going through that experience, I made a comment that would it have been better for them to kind of make a pact to kind of end their own lives as quickly as possible? Because I can't imagine the horror of watching your fellow human like die in front of you and then staying there with their dead body, knowing that that fate was waiting for you in a few hours, in a day, and you had to endure that. I can't imagine the kind of psychological anguish that these people went through. And in the Cape Coast Castle, as I said, to get into that dungeon or the condemned cell, you had to kind of bend down a little bit. I was going in there and I totally forgot to bend down and hit my head like one. And you get in there and you're immediately feeling suffocated. And this is with all three doors open. You immediately begin to feel like I just need I need some more air. And so they only kept us there for a couple of minutes. And we were immediately ushered out and we're like, man, to think that people were there for a few days, suffocating day by day, starving, thirsting until they were dead. That was not only done to them as a punishment, but also done to show the people who were alive that they could not cross the threshold to try to fight for their freedom. And that's how you completely demoralize people. to the point of complete acquiescence to whatever it is that is placed upon them. And one thing I just wanted to add is, as people are taken out of the castle into the ships, some people who had gone through this experience thought that it would be better to jump into the ocean and drown rather than continue on this journey to the west. And many of them did. And some of them, because they were chained together, when one person jumped in, forcibly, the others were taken along. And so many of them perished in the waters even before they got onto the ships. And then, of course, when they got onto the ships, the same thing happened. They were packed like, as they say, sardine. And I had never really pictured that. I have always heard that statement, but I'd never pictured it until I saw an illustration. And I'll take a picture of that and show it here. But once I saw that illustration, I was like, oh, so leaving the castle, you thought leaving the castle was a little bit of respite. Nope. Leaving the castle was just the beginning of that journey, which usually took about a couple of months to get to the west.
Yeah.
And anyway, so there's much more that can be said about this. And the goal of the show today was not necessarily to go through every detail of everything that happened, but my hope is that I have given you a little bit of kind of perspective into the atrocities and into the sufferings of these people. And my hope is, and when you go into the castle, there's a plaque there that reads a message that I think is very important. And I would like to read that.
The thought that you were talking about, there was a guy that was mentioning that what you said towards the end is oftentimes people would think that they were about to enter into something that was freeing, but really they were entering into something that was a lot worse off, and it was almost better to stay where they were at in the castles than to move forward. The second thing that I wanted to touch on before you read that final thing, because I want to be able to display that, because that encompasses the whole purpose of why, because throughout the entire experience you had, and also the purpose of why those castles are now made into museums, kept coming up throughout the footage that we saw and throughout the tour. And I wanted to be able to close on just the idea of what is the purpose of those places. And one guide in particular said something that was very profound.
In the year 2015, 48 Africans from all over the world came over here to put themselves in the conditions the Africans were subjected to. These 48 brothers and sisters first stripped themselves, cover their private parts with those pieces of clothes you see down here. They put themselves back in chains, and they stayed in this dungeon for 12 hours. Of the 12 hours, if anybody felt like using the bathroom, he had to do it on the floor, just as it happened. But you know what? Over the 12-hour period, nobody went to toilet in the dungeon, nobody vomited in the dungeon, we had no menstrual blood in the dungeon. They only urinated in the dungeon, and from urine alone, we couldn't stay in this dungeon the next day for more than 3 minutes. So I began to tell people that no matter how hard anybody will tell the story, we will never be in the position to truly comprehend what they endured. What was the reason for the show? The organizer said Africans may not be in chains physically today, but mentally we could. So all this time he left this door representing knowledge, indicating that with knowledge one could step out of mental slavery. And incidentally, that is what Frederick Douglas said years ago, that knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave. But what is said in the African communities, if you want to hide anything from an African, put it in a book, because the African will not read. So I tell brothers and sisters who do visit that they should never forget they didn't just get to that situation. They were programmed to be in that situation. So the proof of your visit to the castle or a proof of your visit to the dungeons will be to inculcate the habit of reading. Otherwise, you are helping in perpetuating a
Something
crime.
that they had talked about was the door being open and the purpose of why they have that, and it's for knowledge. And the person inside, who was the guide in this clip in particular, quoted Frederick Douglas saying, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave." And so the whole purpose of why they went through, the organizers had that experience and why they have the door present, is to represent how knowledge can free a person from mental bondage, which is what they discussed about how Africans might not ever be in physical bondage again, but it's very capable for them to be in mental bondage. Another quote that they said was something that I've heard from you a lot, and I wanted you to be able to talk about it and have an opportunity to explain your thoughts on what could be seen as modern day slavery to us. The quote, I want to be able to hear this because I remember you telling me, they're like, don't really quote this, but the quote that the man says in the clip is, "If you want to hide anything from an African, put it in a book, because the African will not read." So I wanted to give you an opportunity to explain your thoughts on that.
So
Because
this is,
I've heard this, but the audience hasn't heard this.
yeah.
But I wanted you to be able to talk about that in particular, and then also your thoughts on mental bondage or mental slavery as we see it today.
So I would say, for the most part, the African experience, just in general, has been an oral experience, meaning that a lot of the stories and the history and our heritage has been transferred from generation to generation through storytelling and oral storytelling, and so this is something that we used to say in Ghana growing up, and so today it might definitely seem offensive to say that. However, that is a sentiment that the person in the video alluded to, because unfortunately many Africans don't really know and understand kind of the situations that their ancestors went through, because they have not read the history. And so his perspective was that we need to break that cycle. We need to break that cycle and begin to be people who seek knowledge in every way possible. See, my parents, I've said this before, my parents were into education because they believed that education was the key to economic opportunity. But not only that, I believe education is the key to unlocking our mental faculties. And so when we talk about mental slavery, today we may not see chains on people's hands and foot, but many people are stuck in the same mental state as if they were chained. And it is incumbent upon us who have been educated, or people who have been freed from that mental slavery, to then look to seek opportunities to free others as well. Today's freedom fighting is one that requires us to open people's minds and open their eyes to their true potential. I think the worst thing you can do to a person is to hide from them their potential. And the entire institution of chattel slavery did that. It took away people's dignity. It took away people's understanding of their potential. It took away people's ability to make decisions for themselves. It took away their understanding of their aptitude to a point where many of them would remain or choose to remain slaves even when they were freed. And today I feel that that mindset in some ways still besets us today, and we need to begin to break out of those. Now, talking about the condemned cells, one thing that I wanted to end this with was something that is really important, which is the chiefs of Ghana and the various tribes in Ghana came together a few years ago and said, we take responsibility for our role in the slave trade, and we apologize for the role that our ancestors played in perpetrating this grave injustice to our fellow men. And so when you go to both castles, you would find a plaque that has been written, that has been installed. And the words on this plaque says the following: in everlasting memory of the anguish of our ancestors, may those who died rest in peace. May those who return find their roots. May humanity never again perpetrate such injustice against humanity. We, the living, vow to uphold this. I think this is a message and a vow that we need to take. Each and every one of us needs to take. We need to vow to never let such injustice against humanity happen again. And we need to fight it wherever it exists. As I think about all this and say, what is the purpose of all this? Like, why are we doing all this? And all I can summarize all this into is, this is a jumping point. This knowledge should serve as a jumping point from which we can make the kind of changes that are necessary to move forward. And when we read from this plaque, where it says that, may we the living vow to uphold this, my question to you is that, how are you upholding a world where such injustice against humanity cannot take place ever again? Now, I know it's very hard to see yourself as, being able to solve such a giant problem. But the way I look at it is, you can find opportunity wherever you are, wherever you live, to treat the next person to you just a little better. And one thing I've always said on this podcast is that our goal is to restitch America. And the purpose of that is to look at even those you disagree with as just as human as you are. To look at them as, in my case, I call them potential converts to my cause. And if they're potential converts, then the way you treat them is with love and respect, because that's how we actually make an impact on people's lives. And so how do we uphold a world where such injustice cannot happen? It starts with the way we deal with our fellow man today. As you leave this podcast, what are you going to do differently? When you go online, what are you going to do differently? When you talk to people at a protest, what are you going to do differently? If you begin to look at your fellow man through the eyes of the value, their inherent value as children of God, then it becomes impossible to subject them to any injustice that belies that value. And so that's my message to you today, is let's take this history and let's use it as a way to change the world. And talking about those who are still in what we call mental slavery, I say that when we learn about this, yes, this happened to our ancestors hundreds of years ago. But today, we have to let go of the legacy of slavery by freeing our minds. We have to let go of the slave mindset, which is that the world is arrayed against us and there's nothing we can do to change that. That is the biggest lie you can be told. you have the ability to change your circumstances. And if you feel that you don't, I ask you to reach out to me and reach out to others like me so that we can support and help you in whatever way we can, so you can recognize your potential, so you can get out of this world where nothing is in your control. My message is that we use this as a way to buoy ourselves up and embrace the freedom that we have today. Unfortunately, there are millions of people today who are in similar situations with sex slavery and human trafficking and so on, which is still going on in various parts of the world. And we need to be just as vigorous advocates for those people as well, to break down the networks of this human catastrophe and to do whatever we can, whether through donations or support, to help those organizations that are fighting to free people, literally, from slavery as we speak. That is my message for today. And I thank all of you for listening to this episode. And I hope it has been inspiring to you. And I hope it has given you a little bit of a perspective that is necessary. And I really want to thank the people at Elmina Castle and the Cape Coast Castle, because I was able to take my drone there and they gave me permission to film. And so I'm really grateful to them. And then also the guides that took me through the process and explained everything so well. I'm so grateful for that. And I'm grateful to be doing this today. I'm grateful for the audience that we have. And as I said in the beginning, if you've never shared our show, please take the opportunity to do so today, because maybe this message is what somebody needs to hear. Maybe this message is going to be a catalyst to change something in somebody's life. So please share this as widely as you can. Thank you so much for listening to episode number 24 of Restitch America. If you enjoyed the show today, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this podcast with as many people as you can and help us grow the network to Restitch America. And then also, I want to leave you with a challenge today. And that challenge is to comment on this show, this episode, and answer the question, what do you think is necessary to help people break off the mental shackles? So comments below, and then also, how do you think we can help in the effort to combat this kind of human slavery that is continuing to persist in our world? So comments below and interact with this video as much as possible. And we will see you next week for our 25th episode, which is going to be fabulous. So stay tuned. Make sure you put it in your calendars, and hopefully we'll see you next week.